Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today, The Digitization of Legal Data. Why is everyone talking about it? My name is Doug Donahue. I'm a partner at Linklaters, and I'm going to kick off today. I'm joined by a fantastic group of speakers. In a minute, I'll hand it over to Andrew Caira, Managing Partner, Eden Point Partners, LLC, and consultant to ISDA, and John Pucciarelli, Head of Industry and Regulatory Strategy, Acadia Soft, for some additional introductory remarks. And then we'll move on to the main event, which will be a panel discussion. That panel discussion will be moderated by Heather Smith, Senior Attorney here at Linklaters, with Lou Rosado, who runs Investment Operations, Global Business Strategy, and Relationship Management at BlackRock, Bill Thum, Head of Legal at Vanguard, and Wendy Yun, Managing Director and Associate General Counsel at Goldman Sachs Asset Management. I'm very much looking forward to the panel, so let's kick off. At a high level, what we're here to talk about today is the importance of data. And as we all know, the financial industry is data obsessed, as we should be. We use data to calculate and make payments and deliver collateral, to analyze the effect of market events and numerous other functions, many of which occur one or more times daily. As a result, we're also obsessed with being able to efficiently and effectively access and analyze that data. And over the last year in the work from home environment, we have dealt with unprecedented challenges with respect to accessing data. Ultimately, what I think we all want is to be able to use our data to automate some or most of our everyday processes like payments and collateral, and to be able to pull up data across our whole portfolio with a few keystrokes to analyze the impact of a market event. But for me, the key and maybe the challenge to all our aspirations with respect to data is the accuracy of that data. The source of this all-important data in most cases is a legal agreement, and that is potentially a problem, right? Whether it's in a ISDA or a repo document or a credit facility, the data needs to be extracted from the agreement. And as we all know, legal agreements can be very complex, and in most cases probably require some sort of interpretation because there is no standard or structured way in which legal agreements are drafted. And that's why we believe that data should be created in a standard and structured format that can be automatically operationalized, thereby eliminating any need for data transposition from agreement to data tool and the possibility for mistakes and errors. And let me be very, very clear. Creating data in a standard and structured manner has no impact whatsoever on what can be agreed, right? So there are no commercial restrictions that we're talking about here. What we're talking about is really allowing us to efficiently and accurately identify and tag data in these agreements for use downstream. With accurate data in a format that is fit for purpose, we'll be able to achieve much greater levels of automation and straight-through processing. And perhaps most importantly, at least in my view, we'll be confident that the data we have is 100% accurate. I'm now going to hand over to Andrew to take us through some recent industry polling.
Thanks, Doug. We thought it may be good to share some of the insights received from last week's ISDA AGM. A continuous theme of the sessions focused on digital optimization. Here are a few polling questions the AGM participants were asked. So the first acknowledged the high degree of complexity, as Doug had mentioned, in the derivatives life cycle. Participants were asked which areas they thought are most operationally complex. And 51%, a majority, pointed to legal agreement data, including credit risk management and netting, followed by collateral management, transaction reporting, trading systems, and 1% thought that none of the above. The next question to the right asked participants if their firm developed a database of documentation to capture certain provisions, whether manually or using a technology solution for litigation, regulatory requirements, improving legal agreement data quality, or to better align legal agreement data with business and operational processes, including netting. 58% responded that they had done this to improve the overall quality of legal data or to align agreement data with business and operational processes. If we could go to the next slide, and before handing over to John, I wanted to go to the next question, which I think is an interesting one. When asked what their firm's primary focus was in leveraging new technologies to facilitate greater automation to obtain efficiencies and cost savings, 22% are focused on smart contracts and STP, 17% are targeting cloud-based solutions for operational efficiencies, 16% seek AI-designed solutions to provide robust analytics on a large data set and or automating operational decision making, which is a focus. 11% really honed in on natural language processing, NLP, to extract and digitize text from paper agreements. 10% on DLT-based systems to remove duplications in various reconciliations downstream. 5% were focused on the use of digital assets to transfer inherent value. And lastly, a large swath had not yet explored any of these solutions. So what do I surmise from this AGM feedback? Really, it's that technical innovation is clearly on the minds of the industry to help optimize existing contractual, operational, and risk-related workflows. For these technologies to work efficiently, I think as Doug had referenced earlier, it all begins with consistent, accurate, and transferable data. So this might be actually a good segue to hear from you, John, from why data is so important for the industry, but really industry service providers today.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Doug, and thanks everybody for joining today. The question is, why is everyone talking about legal agreement data digitization? I think the surveys that Andrew brought up and talked about, it's no surprise that assessing the complexity in the derivative life cycle focuses heavily on legal agreement data, credit risk management, and collateral. That's kind of the lion's share of what we're seeing. I guess there was one bright spot there. There was 1% of the respondents saying that derivatives ecosystem is already operationally efficient. So who knows who that is? And hopefully it's a point of mind. But anyway, all kidding aside, there is a shift, especially from the operational side, to understand, and it's clear by all this data that we've collected at the AGM and even all of our conversations and we're here today talking about it, that there is a huge emphasis on the effect of legal data and how it interacts with all of the downstream workflows when it comes to operations. I think the reason why we're talking about it is because there are continual inefficiencies that exist. I think a lot of firms are either in the midst of or continuing to look at and assess what those inefficiencies are. But it is pretty clear, and I think the other part of this is that there are solutions that exist today that are not only emerging but continuing to improve to address a lot of this stuff. And I think that's a lot of what Heather is going to talk about in the panel coming up. But I will echo some of the themes that Andrew had spoke about and Doug had spoke about in terms of the standardization and the mutualization of data. It all leads to one thing, which is what we all want from an industry perspective and individual firms: lower costs, more STP, and unlocking value of standardized legal data. And I think the mutualization of data is another key. If we can get the industry to embrace a golden record of data where two firms will confirm each other's legal data, it will unlock tons of different efficiencies going forward. And that's up and down the stream of all of the workflows that are now connected with some representation of their legal data. So we're going to dig into that in a minute. But I did want to just convey that those are kind of the big operational things that from my personal perspective at Acadiasoft, we look at, and we're constantly looking to improve and create more solutions around it. Doug mentioned the virtual workplace too. I think that's quite important these days, especially if you have wet signatures and documents in either PDF form in a file cabinet somewhere. If you think about the volatility of last year for COVID, or even the credit events in 2008, we're going to be in a really bad place if you don't have a digital representation of that data. So there's a lot to unpack here. I'm not going to do it in this short period of time, but I think as we kind of go through this this conversation, we're going to unlock a lot of the challenges and a lot of the things that our panelists are looking at in terms of solutions and how to tackle a lot of this stuff. So with that, Heather, I will turn it over to you, and Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, gentlemen, for a great intro. And now we're going to get over to the panel, Lou, Wendy, and Bill, and get some interesting perspective and some extra layers on that background information. So the first question we're going to really talk about reflects on some of the polling data that Doug and Andrew were talking about from last week's AGM. Specifically, on one panel that was discussing collateral management transformation, participants were asked which areas of collateral processing would benefit most from standards and digitization. And there was an overwhelming percentage of 46% focused on legal document digitization. So why is everyone talking about this digitization and legal data, and what does that mean to you? Wendy, I'd like to get a little bit of your perspective, and then maybe Bill, you could chime in too with some thoughts from the legal side.
Sure. When I think about these terms, digitization and legal data, I think of them in a couple of different buckets. One is obviously, as John alluded to earlier, about being able to find the documents. It used to be in the past, because of the 2008 crisis that some of us have lived through, having at your fingertips copies of the executed agreements plus guarantees, plus being able to know what are the actual material terms, whether it be not only collateral terms, but also the default terms, cure periods, notice requirements across all the relevant trading agreements that you would have with a particular dealer. Having that immediately available is something that's critical, especially in times of crisis. And then you think about day-to-day issues with like the margin, knowing about your reporting obligations to dealers, whether it be financial statements, NAV statements, any other bespoke terms that you need to capture and be aware of. That's very critical in this day and age, to be able to have that ability to get that information very quickly. I think the other issue is in relation to the downstream systems. So not only the interface with the dealers, externally, but internally, how do you ensure that every relevant stakeholder knows the obligations that they hold in relation to this contract, whether it be the delivery of financial information, the monitoring of NAV triggers, the margin terms, the eligibility of collateral. All of those material terms need to be actually captured and actually flow through the relevant stakeholders so that they can also monitor and do their parts of the job. So those are areas that we look at when we're thinking about data and what's the best way to streamline our processes internally. I think an issue that we see, though, is in relation to it's easier to do when you have standardized templates or standardized types of master agreements, because people that are now putting the data together, or how you create those documents, either electronically or otherwise, there's more of a standard process that you can go through. Like everyone knows, for example, in relation to an ISDA master agreement, the schedule or paragraph 13 to the credit support annex. When you start delving into other documents that are not standardized, like prime brokerage, some futures agreements, other types of agreements that are not based on a standardized model, that creation and storing or capturing of the data becomes much more difficult, because they're more bespoke contracts that you have to capture, which makes it that much more challenging to do so on an electronic basis without having to have many different models or many different types of templates.
Heather, when we worked together on the sell side, we hired about 20 college grads to get tens of thousands of ISDA master agreements and credit support annexes into a database. The database was to do a number of things, certainly to drive the collateral management system, but also to feed into our risk systems, making sure that we had even the name of the counterparty consistent. But then, as Wendy described, across a myriad of ISDA terms and conditions. It took about a year, but we got about 50,000 agreements into that database. When I came to Vanguard, the first question in my first interview was, do you have a documentation content database? And, they looked at me wondering what in the world I was talking about. It took a couple of years, but we developed a system with an external vendor, and at this point we have the content from all of our ISDAs and CSAs, our prime brokerage agreements, our futures agreements, securities lending, repo, all in a database. And that database at Vanguard, as well, drives the margin management system. Our risk system connects to the front office, so the portfolio managers and traders know who has agreements in place, where they can trade. And it has been really transformational across a number of levels. One, for your teams, the first couple of years at Vanguard, we were bombarded with questions. There'd be a credit downgrade or a NAV decline or something would happen in the market. And even collateral terms, we would call the collateral management team and verbally tell them what was in the CSAs or send them an email. They would then input something and like whisper down the lane, probably 50% of the time got it wrong. With the documentation database, it's 100% right 100% of the time. And it has saved my team just an enormous amount of time to spend their time doing much more higher value added work. I was looking at the slides from the ISDA AGM, and I noticed at the bottom that the opportunity to transfer assets through distributed ledger technology, to be able to enter the next age where assets are transferred digitally, and really the future of risk management moves onto a platform like that. You have to have the digital recording of the legal terms in your agreements. So the new age that's upon us will be built upon what we do now. And I think it's great that ISDA, with ISDA Create, is really at the forefront, of this next effort.
Great. Thanks, Bill. You're right. I remember having everyone review those documents for the first year and a half on Wall Street. That was quite a project. But let's turn to the ops side. Lou, we've kind of heard now from the legal side on why they think digitized legal data is important. But from your perspective, what does your firm view as the most important use? Is it business terms, automation, risk management, resource management, counterparty reconciliation, all of the above? Most of the above. What do you think, Lou?
Heather, it's all the above, and I'll go back to one of the comments that Andrew started with. The alignment of data is very critical. If you really distill down what Wendy and Bill just talked about, and by the way, I give credit to all the lawyers that negotiate these agreements, and all the data then that resides in them that actually is not static, it lives, and it moves through the life cycle. The entire investment life cycle today, whether that's to manage risk, creating an investment idea, onboard a client, negotiate agreements with your counterparties, lives through the life cycle continuously. And so for us, it's really, like Bill mentioned, but also really expanding it beyond just a database and capturing data and using really intelligent technology to do all that. How do we bring that quality up at that higher level through the life cycle in real time? And a lot of the data, and I use the terms loosely, static data, reference data flows in and out of our operating platform. It's highly dependent on then what a counterparty or a provider that we transact with then has in terms of where they maintain all that information. And then, the problem is then the disparity between it all. And then the redundant reconciliations that then live through the life cycle of things, from a trade or an investment idea to a trade, to post-trade activity, through asset searching activity that continues. And in the derivative space, obviously, hyper complex. It's not simple like other listed cash products that we maintain. So in summary, really, all that data is important. And then it's a mechanism. How do we bring the quality of data up through real-time processing? And, a great dependency is then how does that then transfer through the life cycle in an interoperable way? So when we negotiate agreement, and it's a bilateral agreement or it's a master confirm agreement, those data points that live in those agreements impact then how we transact and maintain a position, move margin and collateral, reconcile data points, reset activity on those swaps continuously. And the automation is really available to us today in all the forms, I think, that also John and Andrew started with, whether that be AI, NLP, cloud technology, API connectivity. Those are the things that we're investing in heavily through the full life cycle. and from an ecosystem interoperability viewpoint to allow for that higher level quality and real-time processing of this data.
Thanks, Lou. Yeah, it's not just a want anymore, a wish list. It's something that everyone seems to need. And Doug mentioned this very early in the opening marks, and I do want to pull back to that before we talk a little more about accuracy. And it's about how the world has changed over the last year with the pandemic, and how work from home, flexible work arrangements, how that's kind of changing the way, not just that we think, but how we work and how we're going to work on a go forward, even when things get slightly back to the new normal. Wendy, how do you think this change, even if not everybody is full work from home, how is digitization becoming more important in this new environment?
Sure. I think that, obviously it basically tipped the scales for those that were reluctant. I think for any parties who were reluctant to actually use either like electronic signatures or to have access to documents on a digitized basis, it really now brought it to the forefront, I think, to them to realize that they have to now get on the program because of the fact that you may have these situations in the future where you cannot go into the office, you cannot access these documents or get physical signatures on documents. So I do think that most people in the industry did recognize this need even before the pandemic, whether it be from other disasters we've had and other closings because of hurricanes and other situations, and also as teams have gotten bigger and more global, where you're seeing either people now sharing the same documents, needing to have access to the same level of information. We're removing, key federation teams and other stakeholders to different locations, different countries. So this idea of having a centralized source of information rather than having to track a single physical document, I think that has really caused people to really think more, and pay more attention to the actual ability to have digital access to information on a centralized basis.
That's right. Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And not just have information, digitized information, but I think, and this has become a theme, I've heard everyone mention this at one point, is accuracy, right? Lou talked about a higher quality. Andrew and Doug talked about accurate data, because without accurate data, it's really just data or it's information. And Bill, you actually already talked about this a little bit, so maybe you can just highlight a little more about, do you think firms, and it doesn't have to be just your firm as a rule, has on-demand access to legal data and enough confidence in the accuracy of such data that they could respond in a dynamic market risk event like a large-scale Lehman bankruptcy or something else, even the pandemic in the beginning when people didn't have this ready access to their home or to their work environments?
Yeah, Heather, I think it's a really great point. And, at this point, with the systems at Vanguard, we've got, it's a globally accessed system. So folks in Melbourne, folks in London can look up the documents, can see what's in them, without any delay or having to reach out to a colleague. In the various stakeholders throughout the organization are permissioned to look as well. And they can not only see the data, but they can also run reports across a whole host of variables if they've got research needs to see about the terms in the agreements. And then our margin management system reaches in electronically into the database and takes all the margin terms directly from the database to drive the margin management system. So it's completely automated connection between the two. I think the point that you're getting at is the reliability of the data. And at least with the system that we have at present, it does still require a human being to input the data from the start. Now, we have various checks and balances through the process to make sure the data is right. But the next iteration really is for the database to be populated directly from the agreement in the course of the negotiation and the finalization of the agreement. And I think that's where, is to create similar systems, are the ultimate future, to be able to come up with standard templates, to have a negotiation process that is electronic and recorded and tracked and accountable, and then to have the terms in the agreement, the operational terms, the business terms, the risk terms, all automatically feed directly from the contract into the database to be used by the organization. And I think once you have that, which is the next stage that we're looking at, then you've got that 100% certainty, because you've really got to try and take the human element out of it. The human element's important for the negotiation. The human element's important to use the data for different purposes. But the input of the data itself should be completely direct, standardized, and electronic.
That's right. Yeah, we want to keep the lawyers. I want to keep the lawyers. I think a lot of us want to keep the lawyers. But thinking about that, you're right, and removing that and creating a more standardized process, a standardized way to create this legal data. Then I want to talk about it with you, Lou, because coming from the other side, do you think over time, as more and more ways, more and more methods or systems create the ability to create automated, standardized data, will that improve the post-execution processing, time to trade, transparency? I mean, you said you already had seen some changes. Do you think it's going to increase exponentially over the next period of time?
Yeah, and I hope so. And trust me, I believe your point in terms of, this is not about standardizing to a degree where we take out a client focus in terms of that variability or bespoke nature of certain things that we do that really make sense for that client. So, driving standardization, you get the natural benefits, I think, not just from the agreements, all the way then through the life cycle, kind of like I touched on, in very concrete, meaningful ways. When we moved, when we look at swaps and the evolution of rates products, credit products, index products, there's a lot of normalization that took place over time. ISDA has helped with that, obviously, with the idea of the common domain model that allows for that standardization and portability then of information in a variety of ways. We moved from bilateral agreements to then MCAs that allow for electronic confirmation as an example. And the concept of affirmation equals confirmation evolved as it related to that standardization. And so a lot of the terms that fit into a swap or swap wrapper really are very generic and become normalized over time. Total return swaps obviously take a lot of different forms that allow for some of that bespoke nature of the product itself and then the delivery of that investment idea to the client. But you still have, in terms of those products, a greater opportunity to standardize certain things to allow then for the digitization of not just the agreements, but then the activity that follows when we do a trade. When we have to allocate and confirm the trade, then that position lives on and has to be maintained, based on the terms, whether they're normalized and standardized or they're bespoke. And so, the common theme is the more you standardize, the more you'll be able to digitize and then be more portable. Because frankly, and some of our counterparties may not like this idea, but the idea that I can move and execute with one counterparty and move information and make choices on how I trade, where I trade, based on my client demands, then allows me more portability. And standardization will effectively offer that. And if we take the friction out of maintaining data through a life cycle like we're talking about today, then actually I think the swap counterparties, the capital markets businesses kind of converge with the clients in the idea that the main reason we have the relationship is for them to provide credit, to source the balance sheet, to be able to focus on the risk and the investment process, not all the friction to do a trade, maintain it from that point as a position, relying on all that data. So I think it's standardization is a good thing. I'll end with one point. The standardization will then allow for more disruptive things, I think, to take hold. If we're playing DLT as an example, the idea today and beyond a pilot to real live use cases of moving information into, swaps into a distributed ledger platform really are driving off that standardization as part of the parallel process to build the technology and the processes and the data sets that will allow for that.
Yeah, Bill had said that too. He said earlier that some of that framework is being built now, right? The data, the digitized legal data, that information is going to be kind of the footprint, or we should call it I don't build houses, but like the framework, the bottom of the house to get us up to that standard. And I think you hit on an interesting point, Lou, and I want to turn back to you, Bill, one more time. We know how documents are stored now. We know a lot about from this dialogue and this great panel today, how the information is being used and what departments are using it. But do you think that data can also improve, relationship management within your firm, with your clients? I mean, even with the sell side itself. How do you think the buy side will benefit from any future changes or more changes like this?
Yeah, well, internally, obviously, we won many friends because it used to be folks would have to call us and spend a week to get an answer to a question as we tried to find the documents and look for the answer and then make sense of whatever the negotiator negotiated that was forgotten the minute the negotiation ended. Those days are behind us now. So now, and I think it's important to note, and for everyone listening, there is a cost associated with this, and it does take time and effort. As I mentioned, when Heather and I worked together on the sell side, we hired 20 college grads, and they spent about a year putting 40,000 agreements into a database. At Vanguard, we didn't have that many agreements, but it did take a considerable amount of time to work with the stakeholders to find out exactly what information they and their systems needed, and then to tailor our development of the system appropriately, and then finally to populate the database and keep it maintained and updated. So there is an expense associated with it, but I'll tell you something, my team absolutely loves the system. They invested their hearts and souls into developing it because they knew it was going to free them from kind of the lowest level work imaginable and allow them to devote time to much more value-added exercises, while at the same time, the stakeholders love to be able to go into the database, do their reports, come up with answers to their questions, self-help throughout the process, and they know the data is accurate. So yes, it has benefited relationships. I think in terms of relationships with the sell side, it's really kept us all honest and everybody on their toes. We can run reports within our system to compare the agreements with different sell side counterparties and see which ones have the strongest terms, which ones are deficient. And at least at the outset, that can help drive trading, where we get not only best prices, but also have the best credit terms and risk terms in the agreements. And it can help us to leverage in our negotiations with other counterparties to upgrade the documents because we actually know and can see on a live basis where an agreement is superior and where an agreement is deficient. So yeah, I mean, the ability to use this data to drive what we do is absolutely fantastic, and allows a higher order of work to be done, and you basically stop doing a lot of the valueless things that you've been doing for decades.
Yes, it doesn't replace the lawyers; it shifts the focus. I thought I'd highlight that one more time. But Wendy, I want to flip over to you. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I think what Bill is saying really helped to get your input too on how having these documents and having some digitization and the data that we're all starting to organize, or in some cases are really far along in organization within separate institutions, how that's benefiting your communication strategy inside your firm, as well as outside your firm with for trading and other relationship purposes.
Sure. I would echo everything that Bill had just highlighted. I think that, it has really streamlined the process. It really has also provided the leverage for people on my team to be able to focus on true negotiations or legal issues rather than answering a flood of questions about where, updated constituent documents, what are the terms in an agreement? So rather than them dealing with those kind of day-to-day questions, they can then focus more on the substantive work. In terms of the external communications, I do still think that there's some room to improve. Gone are the days, luckily, where we had to sit there and manually send over, multi-megabyte files, tax documents, and other constituent documents for credit review and AML. And that process has now been streamlined. And then, again, I think where I think there could be more improvement in the process externally is knowing where the negotiations stand. Is it with credit? Is it with compliance? Is it with the operations or risk teams? What's holding it up? And that'll give us more transparency into the process so that we can keep our internal stakeholders apprised of any issues or escalate any problems or delays. And I think that we're getting there. We're getting into a better place. And I think with, ISDA Create and other products, where you can have more transparency into the process, that will be helpful. But again, I do think that we still need to be thinking about a broader picture beyond the standardized documents and some of the more bespoke type of agreements. How do we try to digitize those? How do we try to make that process more efficient? From an internal perspective, too, it's also helpful having, a system where people can see what is the current status rather than constantly asking our negotiators or lawyers for status updates. If they can look at it themselves and see where it stands, then again, you can get rid of or mitigate some of the noise around those types of, day-to-day inquiries. I do think that the process right now, again, we talk about the creation of the agreements, the capturing of the data from the point of inception of the documents. Bill brought up a great point about the maintenance of it. The accuracy really depends on a human right now to include any bespoke amendments. You got to think about the Dodd-Frank protocols, the EMIR protocols, all these different market initiatives. How do you capture that additional data, additional modifications, the LIBOR transitions with the PAI interest rates, things like that might affect, maybe implemented through rulebook changes by a clearinghouse or by CSA amendments. How are you making sure that those are picked up on the post-execution basis with the confirms? There are sometimes additional legal terms that are included in them in individual confirms or in MCAs. How do we ensure those are also picked up, right? So people know about any kind of tax indemnity clawbacks, any types of additional, disruption events that are unique to a specific trade. Those are things that I think we still have some room to improve upon to capture those types of bespoke terms.
Yeah, Wendy, you and I had talked in the past about how if someone asks you for a copy of a document, it's not, they think it's simple. It's not simply, oh, hold on, let me grab that one document for you. It's let me grab that document and then check in 5 other systems and call 3 other departments until you're 100% sure that you have, a completed pack. And that's still, can be a difficulty with all the change, right? It's not just an ISDA and a schedule, it's an ISDA schedule confirm and all the other docs. So thank you. Turning back to you, Lou, I think, again, you've hit on a lot of these points because we talked about this at other times, but do you think as we improve the process, just the overall life cycle of an onboarding a client, the documents to trade execution, do you think the industry has a proper strategic approach to establish the relationships for document negotiation with the timely and accurate capture of these terms as we move to more digitization? And can you give us some ideas or recommendations that you think would help? And, and does it still require as much communication with, the front office, the back office, and the legal teams? Like how can this process be better?
I'll unpack that a little bit. I think the really key thing, starting with that optimization, that view of front to back, really BlackRock had in its origin as a firm the idea that the life cycle of things is connected through that investment life cycle. That the trade's done. That's the trader mentality of a trade's executed doesn't stop in terms of then the trader's focus then on what lives on. Where we still see in the world today some of that siloed approach to thinking. Trade's done. I don't worry about what happens post trade. We had the privilege, obviously, of building that into our principles, that we follow finality through the life cycle and we're all connected to it. And I think that then the evolution of our platform, which is a separate business for BlackRock, evolved around that thinking too. Things are connected, workflows connected. your job's just not done when you've done your slice of that vertical. It lives through that horizontal set of things. It continues on, and we're all staked into that. And then technology evolved that obviously within our platform. I think the easy win, or some of what we're seeing motioning, is that there's a greater view of that idea throughout the ecosystem. So the siloed approach is really a recognition that things don't stop. Finality is not reached when your portion's done. For our client investment, that life cycle of things lives on. And a lot of the data then, whether it's the legal agreements and attributes of managing risk or trade, then fit into things together in that symbiotic way. And so you're seeing, I think, the external systems thinking of it from that same approach. But another key thing, and I'll end with this, is really, if you look at the different workflows that sit in those vertical things, there's a higher degree of automation in some areas and not translating down to others. Onboarding was a great area where really there's a lot of manual processing today on the street. BlackRock itself, along with our dependency on our counterparties and providers, we're seeing an advancement of investment in technology that allows for greater automation, like Bill and what you're talking about here. And then the interoperability is where I want to end. It was like we might invest in our proprietary platform or partner with third-party platforms. It's really critical that we're building that interoperability, whether it's your proprietary investment or third-party connections, to allow for the ecosystem to speak or move information and data more interoperably through that life cycle of things. You know, and we might speak Aladdin and Goldman might speak Marquis, but they're starting to have a translation layer or appreciation for a common language. That standardization piece, Heather, is now allowing for our languages actually to flatten out a little bit and understand each other more in real time. So it's interoperability is a key theme through the life cycle. It's about people getting that first, then the platforms or process can evolve from that point of view, and we can innovate through the cool technology that's available to us today to do that more intelligently over time.
Do you find that the communication is easier too in this process, the transparency? I mean, I come from, and I know Bill and Wendy can probably echo this from the legal side, more from my sell side days. You know, it's stuck in legal, right? Is it more transparent if it's moving through your life cycle now, or are there ways to improve that as well?
Yeah, it starts like that vertical, legal and compliance. Our lawyer, Rick Ostrander, sees things from the front to the back. He's not stuck in his silo just worrying about negotiating those agreements. He's doing what Bill just highlighted, really, is how do I make that more normalized over time so that, you know, we're getting the benefit of that standardization. And then that he has great appreciation for those agreements impacting how we confirm a trade, as an example, or how we hold the position and maintain it continuously until we're out of that position. So he looks both ways. And so, it starts with the investment professionals, the folks that implement those investments, the legal folks, the ops folks, technology actually combining to see it that way.
That's right. Thanks, Lou. And Wendy, Bill, anything else about that process, the front to back, anything else you guys?
You know, and Wendy touched on this, and Lou did as well, the new account onboarding. That process was difficult before Dodd-Frank, and it became near gridlock, after Dodd-Frank, with requests from every single dealer for every bit of information about each fund that Vanguard has, and constant updates. And really, we had several people on the team that just did the account onboarding. Now we send all the information once to a vendor. The vendor, tracks everything, makes sure that everything is complete and up to date. And then we permission each of the dealers for all that information, and they grab the information out of the vendor database. And effectively, that thing that took probably two people, the complete time that they were at work, now is done like that every time we launch a new fund. Every time, a new tax form is needed, every time there's a change, it all goes to the vendor sends it out to all the dealers. So that, in terms of communication, it's fantastic. I think too, the thing you're talking about is accountability, and Lou touched on that too. And eventually, I think when we get to use ISDA Create, the tracking of the negotiations, where decisions reside, who owns the decision, what decision is made on what basis, that whole thing will be collected and stored so that we understand, in the life cycle of the negotiation, who's got the responsibility, who's holding things up, who's moving things along, and it will speed up the process enormously. And the old excuse of, well, it's with legal, no longer will apply, because it often is not in legal. It is with credit or risk or ops or the front office. So I'm all for that too.
Hey, Heather, I just want to add one quick thing what Bill said, because here's another way it converges. It really gets into then what Bill's talking about, whether it's derivatives agreements and or financing agreements or cash product things. What we do that move that data through the lifecycle from onboarding and maintaining through to a counterparty also translates to information flowing to a custodian. So we have a lot of what Bill just highlighted, really looking at it through those different products. And so there's convergence or leverage to be had building a better onboarding process, looking at all those things, not just in one product set or another.
It's everything. Yeah. And Wendy?
Yeah, I would add to what Bill was saying. I mean, obviously, I think getting more accountability, but also the transparency, so that, again, historically, you often hear that if a document is initiated but it hasn't been signed, then it's always with legal, right? That seems to be the common rationale for what's happening. Having the ability to say it's been sitting with X group, or it's sitting right now, or it's being held up because of Y group. Not only will it help figure out how to escalate and work through that bottleneck, but also you can look at that data later on and say, is there a particular issue with a particular dealer, right? Is it always sitting with credit for too long? Is it always sitting with a different group, with the legal team for too long? And then you can make improvements based upon, being able to review that data and seeing the metrics in that regard. One area that has really helped us in streamlining the process is also just plain vanilla onboarding. So if you have a new launch of a fund or separate account mandate where you're adding the account to an umbrella existing ISDA template or other trading agreement template, we would spend a lot of time, because you have competing launches, competing requests with the dealer, knowing, and they're at various stages of the review. Some are ready for documentation and an amendment. Others are still going through credit review, figuring out how to cut the amendment. Having different negotiators working with the same dealer, there's always also the risk of potentially having the same, two different negotiators, negotiating the same amendment, like amendment number 10 to the document. So having the ability to do so electronically, and having that efficiency has really helped, make the process a lot more streamlined. And again, it gives us more latitude than to focus on the more important types of substantive negotiations that the legal team should be working on. So I think that, as we find more efficiencies in the process and ways that we can improve, it is something that will benefit everyone, not just the legal teams, but also the risk teams, the operations teams and others, because having that information readily available and being able to use it to continue to improve the process is something that will be beneficial for everyone.
All right. Well, thanks, Wendy and Bill and Lou, for that. And, I think you kind of touched on the last question that I really wanted to talk about as we close this panel out. And it's really highlighting a lot of what we just talked about, as well as considering how the world has changed. Right? I always like to joke that, not to date myself, but I used a manual typewriter on an 87 ISDA before Bill hired me to work on Wall Street. So I've seen the change. But, considering all the change and the regulations and how the document, what'd you say, Bill?
It's a small world.
It's a small world. Considering all that change and all the facets of a trading life cycle that Lou was talking about, this has really necessitated and driven the legal documentation change and need for digitization for trading, risk, ops, even the legal teams. For anything that you didn't say or anything you'd like to add with all the experience that we all have on this call, or with the last 10 years lost in mind, even with my manual typewriter, how urgently should the industry digitize? What other information do you want to leave us with? And I give this to the whole panel.
Yeah, I'll just add. I mean, looking back through time, ISDA really has been at the forefront, and it has of innovation in terms of documentation, and it has been the process through which derivative usage has grown so exponentially, used around the world. Back in the 80s when I started, large law firms like Linklaters did a 150-page contract for a single interest rate swap. There's no master agreement, no netting, none of that. ISDA then moved to standard terms and conditions, a master agreement which allowed for netting, 3 iterations of that, credit support annex, which allowed for collateralization of the product, and the ability for an end user to call a bank in New York, in London, in Melbourne, in Tokyo, anywhere on the planet Earth, and say, I want to do this sort of trade with these terms, and every single organization around the world would understand what they were talking about and be able to speak the same language and do the deal. So the future here really is what we're talking about, which is taking these paper agreements to the next level, having them become digitized, and in so doing, allowing that foundational work to support the next growth of the market. And that next growth is through distributed ledger technology, a whole host of new products and approaches that will apply. So, it's always, to be in derivatives for 30 some years, every day is exciting because there's something new going on, and we're right at the threshold of the future. So, and this message in this conference is the message of the future.
Heather, I'd highlight, I think you touched upon also, with regulations, we've seen certain regulators come out with not only document retention, record keeping, reconciliation type rules, but like at one point with the CFTC with the WORM, I never even heard of the acronym WORM until, I heard it from the CFTC about like write once, read multiple. And so that really forced some of us to have to update our processes and our systems to be able to accommodate and comply with those regulations. So that is, I think, a driving force that we will continue to see. It will really push some industry participants to actually focus on this particular issue and this initiative. But then separately, you think about how complicated and how global the industry has become, whether it be because of market, recent market events, or if there's a certain country that might be in trouble, certain capital controls that might be in place. The ability to look at what are your exposures to a single, underlier or single dealer or single, entity, or because of sanctions that may have been imposed. You have to be able to look horizontally across your credit, your cash products, your listed products, as well as your OTC and derivatives books in a holistic manner. So I do think that is something that is also driving people to look for ways, again, to get the speed in the information to be able to do those types of assessments on a real-time basis. And then lastly, I would put in a plug for, the buy side. I think a lot of the, when a lot of the digitization offerings first came out, a lot of it was kind of geared towards like a dealer to dealer type, review and template, not kind of taking into account, or it's taken more time for them to really kind of branch out and expand those offerings to take into account some of the bespoke issues that we have on a buy side basis. We may have an umbrella agreement with the dealer, but we have to be able to accommodate and reflect bespoke amendments that are either driven based on regulations for some of our funds, whether it be 40 Act funds that have to segregate both, variation margin and initial margin, or because of, certain of our clients who have to preserve sovereign immunity based on their own regulations. So the ability to have those systems be more elastic, to accommodate and be able to handle some of the issues that we face as a buy side, where we want to have the ability to input the information once on an umbrella basis rather than having to input it, via every single separate account that's under that umbrella, but also be able to, reflect and also capture anything that might be unique to a specific client, right? And so it's nice to see that the systems are now being expanded and to accommodate some of those challenges from a buy side manager perspective.
I would just end quickly, Heather, with just a thought over the last 15 plus months, really, if you think of the response during this period of time, the ability then to stabilize, maintain resiliency, get back to innovating and thriving in things we do through the volume, the volatility, and the actual the increase in business and complexity. It's actually evidencing most of what we talked about today is happening. The investment in business process or business process improvement, best practice, standardization, automation, it's actually happening. It got us through this period of time. It should hopefully be more evidence for us to accelerate that idea, lead into these things that like Bill or Wendy are talking about in terms of more sound, business process or the evolution of things like DLT or the ability to maintain discretionary, non-discretionary areas of focus for us more intelligently. And if you just look back over time and see the roads littered with a lot of disasters, that this kind of stuff actually got us through, and we invested in further to prevent those things from happening again. And that's the key. And those things are real time. We're seeing that pressure every day. And so we got to keep accelerating the investment here.
All right. Well, that wraps up my questions. Bill, Wendy, Lou, thank you so much for your invaluable insight and just taking the time to join us today. I've actually learned a lot, and I've remembered the old days too on Wall Street. So thank you for that. And I look forward to a time when we can all do this, in person, the old-fashioned way. So, Doug, John, Andrew, do you have anything else to add?
It was really great. I really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone who joined us over the phone and listened in. As Heather said, look forward to seeing everyone in person very, very soon, hopefully.